All right, we're going to have ourselves a second conversation on humanistic psychology, a little more detail. We're going to expand on humanistic psychology as a whole, as well as we'll make sure we don't forget about that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because that's a pretty big one. All right, so humanistic psychology. Here again remind me. It's an old joke. All right, it's still funny to me. Remind me to come back to talk about the paper before we leave. All right. This one, though, however, I think is fairly self-explanatory. But right up front, take a look. I think humanistic psychology is a little bit touchy-feely, all right? It's kind of beyond my realm, but whatever, we'll say. You know that, as we know that there was many people that came after Sigmund Freud, including, of course, people such as Carl Jung and Anna Freud, and we had seen Karen Horney, and we had seen the other guy that pissed off Freud. I don't know, didn't they all? So there's a lot of different theories that came out of psychoanalytic thought. But here's the deal. It also motivated revolt. If you recall, one of the biggest, we said perhaps the most important thing in the history of psychology was Titchener and his structuralism. And we said the reason it was so important is because it pissed off everybody. Well, in the same kind of way that structuralism pissed off everybody because it sucked so bad, we got the same kind of thing going here. We've got the humanistic psychologists who essentially say, you know what, it's kind of a reaction to Freudian theory. It's not a jumping off point, it's a reaction to it. And so in that, we agree. Freud is full of... All right, so at least we agree on that one. All right, so the humanistic psychology is often referred to as third force psychology, with the first two forces being Freudian type psychology, and the second force being behaviorism. That this is sort of an attempt to be something radically different from the Freudian type thinking and the behaviorism that dominated psychology at that point. It assumes that humans are basically good. If you remove the environmental factors. Didn't we see this in Romanticism? We did. Guess what? Romanticism was at the core of existential philosophy. Existential philosophy was at the core of existential psychology. And existential psychology paved the way for humanistic psychology. Okay? The humanistic psychologists make reference to subjective reality, and they say in many ways, again, as a rejection of behaviorism, behaviorism was stimulus response. I mean, they removed the need for free will. The true behaviorists took away any personal choice, anything like that, and they just said stimuli in the environment happen and animals respond. Well, the humanistic psychologist said, no, you have this subjective reality, which is your consciousness, and in a lot of ways, it's more important. And in fact, if memory serves, the previous reaction paper, or maybe the one before, I don't remember which, had something to do with, you want to truly know a human being. Should you know the universal laws of human nature, or should you know what makes him unique? Does that sound familiar? That particular reaction paper topic was obviously motivated by not just behaviorism, but by thoughts of what humanistic psychology has to say. Okay? Clearly, existential psychology was rooted in European existential philosophy. I don't understand existential philosophy or psychology. But people live in the present. They're responsible for their experiences. This is important. People lack courage to face their destiny. We're going to come back to the Jonah complex, which is pretty cool. They flee from freedom. These statements here, you might as well just have copied and pasted them out of the description of existential philosophy. All right? And so healthy people challenge destiny. Memory serves, Nietzsche's concept of the Superman is really, the words here are a little bit less harsh than what Nietzsche was using, but it's really what Nietzsche was saying. And so Abraham Maslow founded the humanistic psychology, and so it's, as we said, mostly aligned with existential psychology. However, unlike existential, it believes that humans are essentially good. Remember Romanticism. If you remove the negative environmental factors, humans would be perfect in some ways. And so we're going to come back to this in particular when we come to Carl Rogers and the way he's going to implement it in a therapeutic sense. Okay. Um, so it's an interesting thing. It's like I said, it's called third force because behaviorism and psychoanalysis were the two dominant views or perspectives on psychology at that time. And this Abraham Maslow says humanistic psychology is not intended to be in any kind of an extension on either behaviorism or Freudian thought because it's a rejection in many ways of both. Okay, there you go. Not intended to be a revision. Um, so it emphasized the positive rather than the negative traits. It focused on conscious experience. Remember, Sigmund Freud said so much of your behavior is driven. It said, okay, Freud said so much of your behavior is driven by unconscious forces. So much of your behavior is is removed from free will. I mean, you don't have a choice. Your unconscious mind makes it happen. And again, even behaviorism, as we know, in many ways rejects free will by definition. But humanistic psychology embraces free will. Okay, it just absolutely embraces the idea of free will and conscious experiences. As it said, as we were saying. Abraham Maslow said behaviorism was narrow and flexible. Yeah, it is. Deterministic and mechanistic. Yeah, it is. I mean, in behaviorism, you're looking for like laws of behavior, mathematical laws. It objectifies, it quantifies, it reduces animals and humans to stimulus response situations. And again, he protested against Freud because Freud, again, was also deterministic and often mechanistic as well. And the conscious experiences didn't really matter. And Sigmund Freud didn't really study normal people. He only studied abnormal people. I mean, that was the very definition of the case study method that made Freud so famous. And in fact, psychology as a whole was focused on mental illness, and they wanted to focus more on psychological health. Okay, health and happiness, things like that. And so they wanted to focus on human strengths, not human weaknesses and failures. Hey, didn't I say that? There. And so here is that word that we talked about in the last presentation, self-actualization. And I mean, here's your definition anyway. The innate human tendency towards wholeness. As I said, it's an interesting concept, not necessarily towards wholeness, towards purpose. I like to think perhaps is a better definition. As I said in the previous slide, in the Christian church, they make reference to a calling or the reason that God put you on this earth or something. And in a lot of ways, I like to think of self-actualization as, this trip, this journey toward your purpose. Okay, and so the self-actualizing person is open to experiences and embraces the higher values of human existence. Higher values. Okay. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, this came out of Aristotle. Aristotle had originally referred to this tendency to manifest the essence of one species. Whatever. Aristotle had referred to this concept called teleology, sort of, or entelechy rather, entelechy. But entelechy was sort of like this energy in the universe that was driving things. Okay, that is to say, and I mean, I'm flashing forward here. An acorn has this cosmic energy, this desire to become an oak tree, because in a lot of ways, to become an oak tree would be to fulfill that acorn's purpose. Okay, and so Aristotle had already referred to this idea that this universal energy, spiritual energy, driving the universe to become what it's supposed to be. And in the same way that there's this energy driving the acorn to become its potential and what it's to be, the universe wants you to find your purpose, to complete your calling, or whatever the word would be. And Abraham Maslow referred to the Jonah complex, which is a fear of one's own greatness or evasion of your destiny. In other words, if you see that your calling is something large, you reject it, you push it away, and you run in fear from it. And so he describes the self-actualizing person. It's an interesting thing. He says, the self-actualizing person, there it is. Okay, you don't see what I'm seeing. My computer's doing weird stuff over there. Okay, there we go. The self-actualizing person, self-aware, self-accepting. They love. They're not paralyzed by others' opinions. I like that. Paralyzed by other opinions. They do what is right. Okay. I like at one point, I don't know where, I don't know if I hear, learn to be unashamed about being openly virtuous. I like that description. A self-actualizing person has outgrown their mixed feelings towards their parents. They found their calling. Um, I love this next one too. Acquired enough courage to be unpopular. Yep, I don't care if you don't love me, all right? Doesn't bother me at all. So it's quite an interesting thing. I mean, that they've decided that doing the right thing is more important than making everybody happy. Okay, and there's something to that. And so Abraham Maslow, in his work, he felt that humanistic psychology, or the third force psychology, was a temporary thing. He was building that, but it wasn't his big goal. His big goal that he was working on till the day he died, and he was a very diligent worker. He was in his office until that day he died, working on this transpersonal psychology, which was supposed to be a fourth force, okay, or a new force or something that stressed the relationship between the individual and the universe. Very interesting thing. I like the relationship between like Shintoism, the Japanese religion that sort of is like saying the entire universe is related to each other. If you change one part, all the parts will change. To truly understand any one thing, you must understand all the components that influence it, kind of. It's kind of a mystical thing. It reminds me slightly of Carl Jung's concepts with the collective unconscious a little bit, but it's really in many ways a very non-Western way of thinking. Okay, very non-Western way. But a lot of people criticized Abraham Maslow. They said, look, I mean, it's a small sample size. You can't generalize. Maslow's subjects that he did use were selected according to criteria he chose. Say, for example, the characteristics of a self-actualizing person equal the characteristics that Abraham Maslow felt that he himself had. It's an interesting, big criticisms. I'm gonna drop it down on you like this. Abraham Maslow never pretended that humanistic psychology was science. It's not science, okay? And all of these criticisms, if you're trying to say what you got is science, then these are good criticisms. These are totally legitimate criticisms. But he says, look, humanistic psychology is not science. Therefore, you can criticize all day long. I mean, but what are you criticizing me for something that I'm not? So it is not science. It is what it is. Carl Rogers took it a little bit different. See, Carl Rogers was more therapeutically oriented than Maslow was. Maslow was more of a researcher or theorist or something. Carl Rogers had his own theory, but he was more an action kind of guy. And he took this idea, again, he took the idea of Abraham Maslow and the self-actualization, and we'll go back to that idea of an acorn. An acorn wants to become an oak tree. Not only the acorn, I mean, the universe wants the acorn to become an oak tree. And if that acorn can somehow remove all barriers to its growth, it will become an oak tree. And so here's the deal. If that acorn falls into a parking lot somewhere, you know what's going to happen to the acorn? It's just going to sit there and rot, okay? If the acorn falls into like some gravel, you know what's going to happen? It may sprout a little bit, throw a couple of roots down, and kind of get stunted. But if that acorn is thrown into a nice pile of rich, dark earth full of nutrients, it's going to become the oak tree. Okay? And so here's the deal. Carl Rogers said, you are like that acorn, and what happens is often you, the acorn, are dropped down into a parking lot. What do you mean by parking lot? Bad life situation, often the family. Sometimes you are dropped down in these bad situations. And he says his job in therapy is to create a situation where you, the acorn, go to the dark earth, the rich, nutrient-rich soil. Okay? And so he refers to this notion. He says, well, what is the environment? I mean, again, we have to remove the idea of parking lots now because we're humans. But he says, what would be analogous to the dark, rich earth full of nutrients for the acorn would be an environment which is full of genuineness, where people are honest with their emotions. An environment where you're accepted, all right? An unconditional positive regard. I love you no matter what. It's this unconditional positive regard. It always reminds me of, again, the Christian concept of grace, the idea of love just because you exist, kind of a thing. And the good environment would be empathy. And so, according to Carl Rogers, many people do not have these things at home. And so he feels that the goal of therapy is to literally create this perfect environment to allow you to sprout and become your potential. All right. We find that Rogers' definition of a self-actualizing person or a psychologically healthy person is a little bit different. Not terribly different, but a little different. A person who is psychologically healthy is open to new experiences. They live in the moment. I mean, they're guided by their gut rather than rationality and opinions. This isn't terribly different than Maslow's idea, though, that you're not paralyzed by the opinions of others or something. So it's not terribly, terribly different. Okay? Well, in humanistic psychology, we find that Maslow would sort of have for lack of a better word, a quantifiable measure of a psychologically healthy person. And a quantifiable measure of a psychologically healthy person is the idea of self-concept. Okay? That is to say, he would say, for example, what is your ideal self? What do you want to be? All right? Then he would say, what is your actual self? Where are you today? Okay? And here's the deal. He says, the success of therapy can be measured because your ideal self and your actual self, if therapy goes properly, will converge on each other. Okay? Sometimes you will get stronger and your actual self will rise, and sometimes you will perhaps release some irrational expectations and drop down your ideal self. And the day your ideal self and your actual self meet each other, that is psychologically healthy. All right, that is a notion, this concept, this self-concept. If your self-concept is such that your actual self and your ideal self match, bada bing, you are good to go. Okay, and so as we go together. Okay, and this is key. Client is responsible for change. Personal responsibility is big in Carl Rogers therapy. You have to take responsibility. Don't blame somebody else. Like mama? Yeah, mama did it. All right. Again, people criticize him a lot, and I'm not surprised. And again, it is what it is. It's not science. I'm going to tell you that, you can read the criticisms. They're not terribly much different than Maslow's criticism. So I'm going to come back, and I'm going to read to you the description from the reaction paper 8. As a scientist, I kind of see humanistic psychology as really touchy-feely. Deep down, I don't really get it. All right. Better than existential psychology. So, it's something. However, the more I learn about it, the more I come to respect it. Okay? There's not a lot of science behind it, but it might well be on to something even if it doesn't have science. Okay? So, this paper is going to be pretty straightforward. First, summarize the basic assumptions, beliefs, and ideas of humanistic psychology. Maybe an easy way to do this, or a potential jumping off point, would be to talk about how humanistic psychology is not behaviorism and is not Freudian. Okay? So that's not a bad thing. Give your opinion of humanistic psychology. You want to call it touchy-feely? Go for it. You want to call it the greatest thing since sliced bread? Your choice. I don't care. All right? No care at all. Just give me a good opinion. And then finally, this last one. If you were to become a therapist, can you see yourself using a humanistic perspective? Okay? And of course, the unstated question at the end here is why or why not? Not just, yes, I can use it. You can be way more intelligent than that. Why? Yes. If you say no, why? No. All right? So this is a chance for, I mean, as we said, the first part of this paper is more factually based. The second part of the paper is more your thoughts behind what you think about humanistic psychology. All right? So I'll look forward to some of these papers because I know some of you have to write this paper. All right? So I'll see these later. All right? See you next time.